Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series, Living on the Margins, our environmental justice series from Decatur First United Methodist Church. We are so excited tonight to have the esteemed Jackie Echols with us. She is the president of the board of the South River Watershed Alliance and has just an amazing amount of information to discuss with us in regards to environmental justice and rivers and how that is something that many of us don't think about, but is truly an issue of concern. So without further ado, welcome, Jackie.
Well, thank you, Beth, and I'm honored to be here and share with you and the listening audience some details about the work of South River Watershed Alliance, particularly over the past 10 years. I'll give a little intro to that, and then I have about 20 slides that I will go through and put a little more context to my kind of my overview. So with that, let's get started. I've been board president of South River Watershed Alliance for about 10 years. And it all started with the DeKalb County consent decree. I worked on consent decrees before, and I know how important they are. And for those who are listening who may not know what a consent decree is, it's nothing more than a federal action that's brought under the Clean Water Act for violations of the Clean Water Act. That's essentially what it is. And 10 years ago, DeKalb County entered into a consent decree with EPA and Georgia EPD that's designed to eliminate their illegal sanitary sewer overflows that have been going on for much longer than 10 years. So that's how all of this got started on the South River. So how did we do this? When I heard on the news that there was a consent decree, that EPA and EPD and DeKalb County had entered into a consent decree, I immediately called the president of the alliance at that point, and I said, "Hey, this is an opportunity. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity, actually. So what's South River Watershed Alliance going to do? Are they going to take advantage of it?" And a lot was going on with her, and long story short, she said, if you want to take it on, we'll support you. And so here I am, but the important point is, as I said to her, the DeKalb consent decree was a once in a lifetime kind of deal. The pollution, and I'll get more to that in a few minutes, had been going on since 1961, and that's when Snapfinger Wastewater Treatment Plant went online. So really for 50 years, even before the Clean Water Act that occurred in 1972, the South River had just been inundated with sanitary sewer spills, from infrastructure and from the Snapfinger Wastewater Treatment Plant. So that's a long time. I mean, that's 50 years is a really long time. So I decided to take it on, and I started looking at just the massiveness of the project, and I started to actually look at what had actually happened in DeKalb over those 50 years as it relates to the South River, from an environmental justice standpoint, from an advocacy standpoint. And so if we take a look at this, the chronology, and what I developed a term to describe this, back in 2010, and that was a culture of avoidance, and that's what had developed in DeKalb County as it relates to the South River for those 50 years before the consent decree. And so it's easy to see just how it could happen, and I'll run through it quickly. In 61, as I said, this is when Snap Clean went online. Residents living near the South River described sewage odors as intolerable. 10 years later, nothing had changed. The odors were still there. As a matter of fact, they had gotten worse. And individuals who lived across the river from the plant realized that their property was unmarketable. That actually led to a lawsuit in '78. I really don't know what happened with that, but obviously it didn't produce any real results because the problem continued. I really don't know why. Still in 1988, Panola Shoals, which is arguably the most spectacular site on the river, was given the name Soap Shoals because it was always bubbling with suds from poorly treated wastewater. And so in 1989, Georgia EPD got involved actively. I mean, they were always there, of course, because by this time, the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, so they were very much involved with water quality. And they provided an order that required DeKalb County to remove nutrients that were causing algae blooms in Jackson Lake. And rather than comply, DeKalb officials sued the Georgia Department of Natural Resources on the grounds that the cleanup was too costly. Evidently, they survived that because still nothing was done to actually force them to, like a consent decree, that would have forced them to take more proactive action. But in 1991, the river was declared extremely polluted, all 60 miles of it. That's pretty much from Atlanta to Jackson Lake. And Rockdale County officials in '99 complained that they could not use the river for treated wastewater discharge because the water was so polluted. By the time it got to them, it was at its capacity for additional pollutants or even treated effluent. So in 2004 through 2009, there were a number of consent orders through Georgia EPD that over time resulted in about $650,000 in fines, but that was for tens of millions of gallons of pollution and hundreds of sewer spills. So, and then in 2010, it was very interesting. Even though the county had done nothing virtually to clean up the South River, and cleaning up would just simply mean try to address the sanitary sewer spills. And EPD consent orders were not working. The county invested, $400,000 and a path that was put in by the Path Foundation. It's kind of the early beginning of this, along the river. You know, after decades of doing absolutely nothing, they decided they wanted a path along the river, their polluted river. So as a result, I mean, people took it as if it was, you know, the river was open and fine, and they could just frolic in it. And so what happened there is that the newspaper got a hold of it, of course, and it was a big deal. DeKalb County, EPD were all called on the carpet because folks took the path as an indication that the river was fine. And there was a headline in one of the local papers in DeKalb County, and the headline was "Frolicking in and I actually think that said frolicking in the polluted South River." And they actually showed, you know, the photos that you see there, children and adults, you know, playing in the river. So, and the consent decree obviously was in the works during this time, because I think it was actually announced in the fall, and it takes a while to put a consent decree together. So they truly were working on it before July 2010. So this is kind of the whole culture of avoidance. You know, for 50 years, nothing happened. I mean, there was all kind of pollution, you know, fines, nothing happened. And then, you know, people just, that culture of avoidance was kind of eliminated when they looked up one day and saw that there was actually access, there was a path, so everything was viewed as being okay. So when I started working on this, I said, okay, how do you get past the perception? How do you get past the perception of pollution in the community? Because people had reacted to that. And a lot of them still do to this day. I mean, they're probably one of the biggest PR problems we have is continuing to promote the message that that the river is so much better than it used to be. Are there precautions? Yes, but we had to figure out a way to undo this culture of avoidance. And that's, you know, and that's what we continue to work on. So, and I'll get back to that later. So the official stance from Georgia EPD about all of this, about the frolicking in the South River, was that the river is unsafe for recreational use. You know, what they didn't provide any more details about their complicity in all of this. And the fact is that it does not have the use of recreation, and it still doesn't to this day. So I needed to have some context for trying to put into words or put into actions how to deal with the culture of avoidance that was going on in DeKalb County, or that had evolved over those 50 years. And you know, being a teacher by trade, you know, taught graduate school, undergraduate school for a really long time, I needed a context, you know, and so I went searching for one, and I happened across a a recently written article by a Dr. Sharon Moran, who still teaches at the State University of New York. And it was entitled Cities, Creeks, and Erasure, Stream Restoration and Environmental Justice. And I mean, I thought that, you know, I was so happy that I had found a piece that explained what had happened in DeKalb over the last 50 years. And it helped to provide a roadmap for how to address it from an advocacy standpoint. And, you know, quick story, you know, about Dr. Moran. When I read her article, I was just so thrilled. I looked her up on the internet and I found her name and a phone number. And she didn't know me from Adam, and I just called her up, and odd enough, she answered the phone. And I immediately started to tell her who I was and where I was. And after about 10 minutes, I took a breath because I didn't want her to think I was crazy and hang up on me, right? So I said, okay, so what do you think? And she said, well, I'm just glad to know that there are some people who read scholarly articles. And I love telling that story because, you know, I'm still in contact with her, you know, after 10 years. So I identified from her work, and there are a lot of other factors. It's a really good piece if you haven't read it. But I pulled out 6 consequential factors that kind of explain what went on for 50 years, and to a great extent, still what goes on in DeKalb County, particularly South DeKalb County. So to run through them pretty quickly, more than any other factor, it is the perceived degraded nature of urban streams that removes them from contention when decisions are made about which creeks or streams to restore. And it's good, the important factor here is perceived degraded nature. Because I always tell folks, nature is resilient. You give it a little help, it cleans itself. And even though there's been a lot of pollution in the South River for years, to suggest that because of that, it is degraded beyond repair is, it's not true. And that's kind of where we are today. But when that perception is created, it's really, really hard to get people past it. And that is still in place with a lot of folks in DeKalb, not only in DeKalb, but across Atlanta, the ones who know about the South River. Stream restoration remains relatively lacking in urban areas where people live, particularly poor minority populations. But most people live in urban areas these days. So it's important that we deal with pollution because folks don't want to drive 4 hours to enjoy water, or to Lake Lanier to enjoy water, when they have a perfectly wonderful river, 20 miles from downtown, or 20 minutes from downtown Atlanta. And all that's needed is just ongoing actions, restorative actions and advocacy that can really make it a wonderful environmental water amenity. Stream restorations are a special kind of environmental amenity, and this is really important. Why? Because accounts of restoration resonate with themes of recovery and redemption. As such, stream restorations become a catalyst for revitalizing neighborhoods subjected to environmental, I guess we should say, injustice. And you can see that just by looking at people who now venture, at Panola shows, venture towards the river, who take photos, who sunbathe, who get involved in all kinds of activities that people normally do, around water. And we are looking at activities and actions that will further bring people into the community, and where the river becomes an economic engine. It's part of the Arabia Mountain National Heritage Area. I mean, there are only 2 or 3 heritage areas in Georgia. So this is a wonderful opportunity for the river to truly be an important part of revitalizing South DeKalb County, all the way to Jackson Lake, as a matter of fact. Stream restorations have both social and political implications. In addition to missing out on the enjoyment of such amenities, people's opportunities for engagement and for expanding their knowledge base remain limited. And it's so true. I mean, advocacy is tough. It primarily means that you need to know what you're advocating for. You need to know the issues. You need to be able to address them with the people who are elected to represent you, who are responsible for actions that help restore the South River. So it's important. It brings about the need for an awareness, and people do build an awareness. There are a lot more people today who are willing to engage in advocacy around the river, who live in South DeKalb County and further downstream than there were 10 years ago. But on the other hand, without a basic understanding of urban waterways and their immediate physical environment, the likelihood of a community developing a foundation for environmental advocacy decreases. And that truly is what happened prior to 2010 for a really long time. There was little advocacy, little awareness. A community that sees its own local environmental condition as normal and inevitable will be hopeless and unlikely to act politically. There's nothing worse than hopelessness. And I can see, I've known and worked with folks in DeKalb County since '95. And there are a lot of environmental injustices going on there, and still are. I mean, the landfills, the sanitary sewer spills. And for a very long time, actually, until recently, folks just didn't think that they could fight this. And that's what South River Watershed Alliance has done more than anything. It has raised the visibility of the river, and I think sends the message to folks that politically there are things that can happen, and that's what we keep promoting. So those are just, as I said, 6 factors that I pulled out of Dr. Moran's writing, her article. And the citation is there. I encourage you to read the article. So let's talk a few minutes about, I mean, we kind of got the context, you know, we got the culture of avoidance. We've got a context for why water is so great as an environmental justice tool. So let's talk a few minutes about the agencies, or the agency in Georgia that's responsible for water quality in Georgia. And this all speaks to the importance of advocacy and taking action and taking on agencies and individuals that need to be taken to task for not doing what they are supposed to do. So the Georgia Environmental Protection, words matter. Let me start this by saying that. Words really matter, particularly here. This is a statement about water on the Georgia EPD Water Protection website. And it says that Georgia EPD manages water resources in Georgia through permits to local governments and industry to discharge treated wastewater, and to local governments, industry, farmers, and subdivisions for surface water and groundwater withdrawals. That is a huge statement. I mean, this is on the website. And the note is that Georgia EPD is responsible for implementing the Clean Water Act in Georgia. So you can see from that statement that there is no mention, go to the next one. There is no mention of people, recreation, fishes, and aquatic life, wildlife. None of that is mentioned in their mandate in terms of water quality and what they do. And that's huge. I brought this up to the person who heads EPD, and you know, he said, well, it's mentioned other places, you know, about people and fishes and aquatic life and so forth. I said, no, but it needs to be here because that's where I went to look for it, and not seeing it was telling. So that's huge for where we are, for water quality issues are in Georgia. There are a lot of people who spend a lot of time trying to improve water quality across this state, in rivers and streams across this state. And the benefit of all of that work is not nearly what it should be when it comes to water quality. And that statement by Georgia EPD tells all about why making progress is, to this day, so difficult. The Clean Water Act is an interesting, I have a greater appreciation for since I've been working on the South River than ever, because I've gotten into the use and designated use of water. And this is in the Clean Water Act. The use of a water body is the most fundamental articulation of its role in the aquatic and human environment. Now, consider how different that is from the statement that's on Georgia EPD's website. You know, this statement doesn't talk about wastewater and municipalities discharging wastewater and farmers withdrawal. It says the use of a water body is the most fundamental articulation of its role in the aquatic and human environments. Secondly, the designated uses of a water body are an expression of goals for water, such as supporting aquatic life, human activities, and recreation. it's a goal, which means, and in terms of advocacy, it may not have that use now, but there is work to be done, and the goal is that recreational use can be attained. So this is a continuum. And if you look at and talk with folks at Georgia EPD, particularly in water protection, it's almost like, because the South River does not meet its designated use of fishing, which is, and I'll get to that in a minute, is the lowest, that there's no hope. So there is no need to do anything else, and no need for Georgia EPD to do anything, because it doesn't meet its designated use. So it doesn't look at water quality as a goal, it just looks at it as being done. And it's interesting, the designated uses of Georgia waters is what you see on your screen. This is not the way it is across the country. Different states have different designated uses for their water bodies. A lot of them have a lot more categories than you see here. But this is what we have for Georgia, is drinking water supplies, recreation, which offers the most protective criteria or standards, fishing, which is the designated use of the South River and most rivers in the state. There are only a few that have water quality above fishing. And it is the least protective of urban streams. It is the default. So it is the lowest water quality designation in the state, which is the designation for most rivers and streams. Then you have, your wild river, your scenic rivers, and your coastal fishing. Of course, those are very limited in terms of numbers. So that fishing and recreation takes on tremendous importance in terms of water quality and advocacy in the state. So stream restoration does not occur until water quality improves, and water quality does not improve until pollution is significantly curbed and or eliminated. That's just the fact. In terms of making progress in the South River and anywhere in this state, that is what has to happen. You have to reduce pollution. There's no other way to do it. So as I was saying, recreational use is absolutely essential to achieving improved water quality in the South River and anywhere in the state, because recreational use is the highest use that most water bodies in this state can attain. South River will never be wild and scenic. It's scenic, but it will never be wild. It's an urban river. So Advocacy Alliance is doing these days. Recreational use, specifically the amount of recreational use a river receives, is the #1 factor that Georgia EPD points to when requests are made to change or update a water body's designated use. That's it. They ask you, how many people use the river? Although they do virtually nothing to ensure that the river can be used in terms of water quality, they ask for data that indicates that it's receiving recreational use. They don't talk about municipalities, businesses, farmers, none of that, except that when you are seeking recreational use, you have to notify and almost get approval from the folks who are polluting the water body. So, you know, it really creates a high hurdle. And when you are requesting to go from, say, fishing to recreational use, Georgia EPD requires that the water body attain the higher use before requesting the change. So it is really very difficult to go from fishing to recreational use in this state. So since South River Watershed Alliance has been working on the river, we kind of, you want to make progress. So there are two things that we have targeted. Recreational use requires that Georgia EPD enforce Clean Water Act permit that limit pollution, period. Every wastewater treatment plant, you know, ones on the South River, all of them have pollution permits. The key is how well are they enforced? Not really well. So that's one thing. Kind of the flip side of that in terms of an advocacy standpoint, and I must say, you know, a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of advocacy and the actions that we have taken didn't occur 10 years ago. These are things I've learned over the past 10 years. Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't. But it's been a process. It's been a process of determining how to advocate for the river, how to advocate for environmental justice when it comes to communities and the river and people downstream. So, you know, I want to reiterate, it's been a process. And one thing I did learn recently is that the Clean Water Act includes what's called a triennial review. Per the name, it's a 3-year rolling review. And the process requires that states protect in-stream water quality based on how citizens are using their water body. That means recreation. You know, and this is huge because every 3 years, the latest one started in January of 2019. There's a public hearing, you submit comments. I mean, unless you're looking for it, you don't really know it. But this triennial review takes 3 years to complete, and then another one kicks in right after that. But it allows EPA, who is ultimately responsible for the Clean Water Act, to consider data that is presented in, that is collected in Georgia and presented to EPA to determine if Georgia EPD is doing what it's supposed to in terms of providing the water quality that's needed for recreation. If you don't submit comments and if you don't, you know, submit data, the process goes on. EPD puts their best face up to EPA and things continue. Nothing changed. But this year, well, 2019, we submitted comments, and I am tracking this process. And it's prompted some changes in how we advocate. And one is, and I'll talk more about it in a few minutes, is something called the South River Check-in. And but my point here is that there are ways to make a difference. You just have to be sure you know what they are and that you're relentless in your advocacy, because that's really, you know, what it takes. So our recreational advocacy is what I call it, you know, because as I said before in this presentation, water quality in South River will not improve without recreation. It will not. So what have we done? What are we doing? In 2012, South River Watershed Alliance launched what I call South River 2020. It's amazing, it's 10 years since the consent decree, which actually ends June 2020. And it's an extension being negotiated. You know, but in 2012, I said, okay, we have got to get people on the river. No matter what they think, no matter what EPA, EPD do and don't do, folks, not getting on the river is not an option. If that's the case, then we can just stop this right now, because nothing's going to change. So the first program that South River Watershed Alliance put together was something, it was an action program called Beyond the Bridge, which are, we continue today, they are canoe kayak paddles. It gets you on the river, and it actually, the experience is something you walk away from that you won't forget. And that, I get that from almost everyone that goes down the river with us over the past 8 years. They are just surprised at how beautiful the river is. They are surprised at how intact the ecosystem is. The wildlife is just spectacular. I mean, the first time we went down the river a couple of times, a ranger from Panola Mountain State Park identified 46 species of birds. I mean, so Panola Mountain State Park is right there. So the wildlife is really spectacular. The river is really spectacular. And it makes people care. This is what's needed to get past that culture of avoidance. And over the past 8 years, we have really made a lot of progress in that regard. We probably won't be able to do outings this year with the pandemic, coronavirus issue, maybe later in the year, but for certain, you know, we'll be back on track with that next year. Another project that came about in 2012, and again, these were long-term, of course, is the South River Water Trail. This has been a labor of love for 8 years because it required that I work with jurisdictions from Decatur County all the way to Jackson Lake. That's a distance of 40 miles and 5 jurisdictions, trying to convince folks who had bought into this culture of avoidance as well, that the South River was worth saving and worth restoring. And so in 2012, we started this effort, and I am, you know, just delighted to report that 2 weeks ago, Rockdale County, South River Watershed Alliance, in partnership with Rockdale County, received a $200,000 Georgia DNR Recreational Trails Program grant for the South River Water Trail. And so we are poised to construct in Rockdale County the first 6.5 miles of water trail. And I am certain that when it's done, it will attract an outfitter. We don't have one now. People have to bring their own kayaks and canoes, but it will become, for Rockdale County, that economic engine as it relates to the South River. Again, the more people you get on it, the more recreation, the more it puts pressure on Georgia EPD to change the designation from fishing to recreation, and then do what's needed to ensure that the river achieves and attains and it's able to support that recreational water quality. The final thing that we're doing as part of this, and again, as part of the triennial review, is the what we call the South River check-in. We have created an online process for people to let us know when they are using the river, whether they're walking, whether they're sightseeing, whether they are paddling. We are able to capture in real time the real data to show Georgia EPD and EPA just what recreational use means and have the data to support that. So just to wrap up, this is, I think what I'll call it, a tribute to South River. The advocacy that we have been engaged in over the past 10 years, the progress that we have made, you know, hopefully I have been able to communicate how important water is, how closely linked environmental justice and water is in urban areas, and you know, invite folks to you know, get in contact with me if they want to get involved, or if they want to contribute to the organization, or if they have questions about the presentation. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, Jackie, this has been really wonderful, and it's so exciting because I haven't seen a presentation on the South River in several years, and the progress that y'all are making is very, very exciting. Does anybody have a question?
Jackie, have you been looking with COVID starting, people can still get out, they just have to be socially distant. What's South River check-in been looking like since things have started in mid-March? Compared to previous years, maybe?
Well, we just started the check-in in, I think it went live in early March, and this is April, yeah, in early March. You know, and last time I checked with Margaret, the executive director, we had 88 check-ins, and I mean, that's, you know, that's pretty good. So people are really, and we're going to make it even easier. The goal is to put up actual check-in stations at each of the launch sites for the South River Water Trail, from here to Jackson Lake, so we can show the entire length of the river, so they can just tap it right there, and it's, you know, and it's real time. So it's a big data collection tool, and I'm just looking forward to sharing it.
Yeah, that's a great idea and a great resource.
Right, exactly. Really exciting. I have a couple of questions in regards to sort of the more engagement. So when I heard you speak last time, like I said, it was several years ago, the South River, out of all the water and rivers in the state, seemed to get the least amount of attention, right? It was sort of ignored. And I mean, you've already sort of addressed some of the issues with DeKalb, but of course it runs longer. How have you been able to engage Rockdale in at least protecting their part of the river?
It's, like you said, it's, Persistence. Just let me put it that way in one word. Persistence. I mean, I have been working with folks at Rockdale since 2013, 2014 about the South River Water Trail. There have been other opportunities and they've been involved with some other things. And so South River Watershed Alliance, this time came around last year, and I worked with them to submit the grant. And actually, advocacy requires some really strategic planning, because folks who don't necessarily support the idea of better water quality in the South River, you almost have to kind of beat them at their own game. And I say that because when I started working with Rockdale, the put-in is at a park, at Lorraine Park. I mean, it's already a Rockdale County park. So that's great, but you need a takeout. And the takeout is 6.5 miles down the river, right? There's no county park. So what are you going to do? I said, okay, let me work on that. It took me a while. I identified some property right there at the best spot to take out at Bridge. It was in private hands. I reached out to the person that owned the property, who again, didn't know me from Adam. It took me 1.5 years to convince them to sell 1.8 acres to South River Watershed Alliance, but they finally did. So, 2 years ago, I solved that problem by buying those 1.8 acres that were needed to make the water trail happen. And so that's the Rockdale story. So now it is going to happen, right? And they are really excited about it. And nothing sells success like success. 2 days after we got the grant from DNR in Rockdale, I got an email from Henry County. And I had, been working with them too. It was slow, but now we have a council person who is interested in, hey, maybe some of this can work in Henry County. So people, I think, have always saw they have been, it hasn't been on their radar. I mean, the river was just there, right? But as a result of our advocacy, folks they see the river as an amenity, as an environmental amenity, as a natural amenity, and they're interested in it. Has it been tough? Yeah, it's been a tough sell. Folks at down at Jackson Lake are some of our best supporters. I mean, they know the importance of it and the challenges because they're at the end. But working through jurisdictions, especially when you have 5 of them, is tough. But it can pay off.
Well, that's great advice for anybody working on these kinds of issues. That persistence, and once you get the first success, then and people find out about it, that it'll help you sort of go down further.
Yep.
Is the wastewater treatment plant in DeKalb the only kind of plant you have on the river? I mean, is it the only one or what else have you got on the river?
There are 2 wastewater treatment plants in DeKalb County. Further down the river from Panola, it's not that far, but yeah, about 5 miles down the river. It's called Pole Bridge. It is much smaller, and that section of DeKalb is much less developed. So there's a lot of capacity there. They don't have the plant is about 10 years newer than Snapfinger. So they don't have any problems, you know, although and because it's not as populated, they don't have as many sanitary sewer spills, but there's still sanitary sewer spills, and but the wastewater treatment plant itself is not the problem. And that's the same thing with Snapfinger now. And that's something people don't know. It used to be terrible, but now it is the Snapfinger wastewater treatment plant. If the cab can get the sanitary sewage to the plant can treat it. The problem is it spills out before it gets to the wastewater treatment plant.
Yeah, that's right. And I know that's part of the whole consent decree. And one of the big challenges DeKalb has is, you know, getting that resolved. And I had heard that it was going to be extended also. If they extend it, how long will it be extended for?
Last I saw, I was looking at some documents I received through Open Records today, as a matter of fact. I heard 5 years, and so now I see 7. And the whole consent decree, believe me, from an advocacy standpoint and a water quality standpoint, is a whole nother, could be another entire presentation on its own. And that's because I will share one thing that we've learned since filing this lawsuit, and that is only a third of DeKalb County, only a third of DeKalb County's wastewater infrastructure, right, is included under the consent decree. You know, so 2/3 of it, of the county, is not.
Oof.
So that's believe me, that's I'm spending a lot of time on that these days, and I've been dealing with that consent decree for 10 years, and I've seen the language, but it never resonated, because you always say, hey, if it's in the consent decree, it's good. I mean, they got to do it. But on it, only 838 miles of DeKalb's 2,600 miles of sewer are included under the consent decree.
That's crazy.
I know.
That's a lot of work left to do then. Well, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. This has really been wonderful. We were so looking forward to having your presentation tonight, and it did not disappoint at all. And so we're really excited that we have such a wonderful, wonderful rock star advocate down on the South River. As you know, I called you, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago, when that guy was going to shred tires down on one of the tributary creeks, and I was like, there's no way I'm doing Jackie in that river. So anyway, you know, it's funny because it does, you know, I never thought I would have any influence at all on what happened on the river, and then there we were. So you've done a wonderful job of getting out in the community and building a network so people know that if something's wrong, they can call the South River Watershed Alliance, and you know, you can help us rectify or prevent things from happening. And that's exactly what happened. They came into community council, and the next morning we were at Kathy Gannon's office, and it was like, no.
Hey, thank you.
Exactly. So anyway, so thank you so much, and we appreciate your time, and we're going to sign out now.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.